Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar titled Adaptive Pathways, Can They Deliver the Triple Win? So I'm Olivia Seifer, I am the digital editor of the Evidence Base and I will be your host for today's event. Before I go ahead and introduce you to our speakers for today, I'd like to just quickly cover a few housekeeping items. So firstly, all the widgets are resizable and movable, so please feel free to move them around to get the most out of your desktop space. You can also expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner. A copy of today's slide deck and our feedback survey are located in the resource list. We encourage you to download any resources or links that you may find useful. Please let us know your thoughts on today's webinar by tweeting us at the EviBase or by using the hashtag EviBaseWebinars, or simply share today's webinar with your friends and colleagues using the Share This Widget button on your screen. Some networks may cause slides to advance more slowly than others, so logging off your VPN is recommended. If your slides are behind, then pushing F5 on your keyboard will refresh the page. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help widget at the bottom of your screen as well. And an on-demand version of today's webinar will be available approximately 1 hour after the webinar has finished and can be accessed using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. So we are delighted to have Isabel Firth, Senior Economist, and Professor Lottie Sturton, the Vice President and Head of Consulting, presenting for us today. And we've also got Professor Adrian Towles, Director Emeritus and Senior Research Fellow of the Office of Health Economics, joining in for the panel discussion at the end. So Isabel joined OHE in 2020. She has an undergraduate degree in natural sciences, specialising in infectious diseases from the University of Cambridge, and also a master's in public health from Imperial College London. She has completed internships at the World Health Organization and Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative. Most recently, she worked at the Wellcome Trust in a number of really exciting roles focusing on digital health, innovation, and user research. Her research interests include inequality, public health, and digital health. So Lottie's research interest focuses on the development and applications of health economic analysis and health technology assessment with the aim of accelerating patient access to high-value healthcare services and treatments. She specializes in quantitative methods for estimating and comparing the expected health and economic benefits of new approaches and interventions in disease prevention, diagnostics and treatment, and prioritizing data collection to efficiently build the evidence for new interventions. Moving on to Professor Adrian Towles. He is the Director Emeritus and Senior Research Fellow of the OHE in the UK. Adrian joined the OHE in 1993 and served as a director there for 25 years. He holds an MA in Politics, Philosophy and Economics from Keble College from the University of Oxford, an MPhil in the Management Studies from Nuffield College and the Oxford Centre for Management Studies, and is a member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants. Adrian was president of ISPOR for the 2014 to 2015 term. So we invite the audience to submit any questions you may have for our presenters throughout the webinar using the Q&A widget to the right-hand side of your screen. We will pose your questions to Isabel, Lottie and Adrian in a live Q&A session after the presentations have finished. Thank you all so much again for joining us today, and I will now hand over to Martina Garau, also from the Office of Health Economics, to start today's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Evidence Base, to host this webinar today with OHE experts. I'm going to very briefly introduce today's topic. So while Isabel will talk about the adaptive pathways, I'm just going to briefly explain what we mean by the triple win, which is, first of all, enabling early access to potentially and promising treatments to patients, and then also, when appropriate, mechanisms are in place, allowing to address uncertainty that can be a source of concern for payers. And finally, when you have early access of new treatments, you're also rewarding R&D investment, and in the long term, you're providing the right incentive to invest in more treatments for unmet needs. So the agenda today, So we're going to start with some sort of overview of the experience of adaptive pathways in a series of geographies, and then Lottie will talk about potential solutions on how to bridge the gap between regulatory and reimbursement, and finally we're going to have a panel discussion. So over to you, Isabel, now.
Thank you, Martina, and hello everyone. As Martina said, I'm Isabel Firth. I'm a senior economist at the Office of Health Economics. And my job today is to really introduce you to the concept of adaptive pathways with some real-life examples to bring it to life. So this is the outline of what I will be talking about today. So firstly, I'll introduce adaptive pathways, the different kinds of pathways there are, and then I'll go through this big list of give a spotlight on challenges for adaptive pathways to link to what Lottie is going to cover happening. So firstly, an introduction to adaptive pathways themselves. So an adaptive pathway is defined by the EMA as a planned progressive approach to bringing a medicine to patients by making use of existing regulatory tools. And all of these kind of this cascade of terminology down the right-hand side are the different ways that people refer to adaptive pathways in their various forms across the life cycle of a medicine. So it's worth keeping that in mind when you see these terms. But first, looking into the definition itself, the planned approach means that it essentially makes use of existing systems and mechanisms, but based on established eligibility criteria applied in a more flexible way. So it's not necessarily brand new, but it allows existing mechanisms to be used more deliberately. The progressive approach is important as well because it means iteratively or progressively the patient's access is increased as evidence is generated and more confidence there is more confidence about the safety, the efficacy, and importantly the risk-benefit balance of a medicine in a certain population, which is talked about a lot. And then I just wanted to highlight that it does make use of existing regulatory tools, but increasingly it's intended to include other healthcare decision makers, importantly HTA bodies, which we'll cover in more detail as we go through. So there are three main aims of adaptive pathways. Firstly is to aid the development of products that are difficult to bring to market, things like rare diseases, where the incentives or the barriers to market are higher. Secondly is to give earlier access to patients for the most promising innovative therapies, and particularly for patients who either cannot afford to wait or stand to gain the most from a new medicine. And then finally, overall, the aim is to change the commercial environment to make the development of medicines more attractive in areas of unmet need. So another definition of adaptive pathways as defined by Eichler et al. Is a lifespan approach to bringing innovation to patients that is expected to help address the perceived access versus evidence trade-off, help de-risk drug development, and lead to better outcomes for patients. So as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, we have a little diagram which exemplifies how adaptive pathways generate an approach. On the bottom, you have a longer time to wait until the first approval, where in that first approval, the entire target population has approval at that time. Whereas through an adaptive pathway, you have the patient group with highest need, which gets access much earlier than others. And then as evidence is generated in the larger population, the final target population also gets access. As you'll see here, the idea is that it doesn't actually push back that approval would be at the same time. It just allows that first approval in a smaller group to go ahead sooner. That's the theory. So just to map the different kinds of adaptive pathways across the different areas or different degrees that they exist in. So firstly, as we said, a majority of them are regulatory tools, conditional marketing authorization, accelerated assessment, accelerated approval, US versus EU, orphan designation for rare diseases, ATMP classification for things like gene therapies and cell therapies, an opinion on compassionate use, which has by the EMA, which has implications for each nation state, and the SME office. So development support tools are ways that these regulatory tools are arranged in specific pathways to enable companies to more easily access them, and in a way that is more streamlined for them. So PRIME is an example of that, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is an EU scheme. ILAP, which is a new scheme launched in the UK. Scientific advice and use of real-world data. And finally, adaptive pathways in the reimbursement space include things like performance-based risk-sharing agreements and coverage with evidence generation, which again we will talk about in a little while. So now I will go on to talking about some examples of adaptive pathways and discuss how they are used. So firstly, accelerated approval is an FDA-instituted program to allow earlier approval of drugs and that fill a certain predefined unmet medical need criteria, importantly, based on a surrogate endpoint. So this is before the full clinical efficacy has been established in patients. So the company is then required, after it has been approved through accelerated approval, to conduct a phase 4 confirmatory study to confirm that the surrogate endpoint does in fact indicate the anticipated clinical benefit that was expected. And the confirmatory trial shows that the drug actually works, and the FDA grants traditional approval after that point. So a recent paper published in May this year did an analysis of spending on the drugs that have been approved for use in the US system through accelerated approval. And it found that Medicare spent $1.2 billion in 2019 on drugs with accelerated approval, but without full approval. So, and the majority of those, 82%, were oncology drugs. And while this may seem like an alarming figure, it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about whether this scheme works or not. It represents a very, very small proportion of total Medicare spending in 2019. And it doesn't necessarily tell us the crucial thing, which is whether the surrogate endpoint and the clinical efficacy are aligned. But it is well used, as you can see. And there are other pathways in the US, such as priority review designation, fast track designation, breakthrough therapy designation, regenerative medicine advanced technology designation, and expanded access, which is a form of compassionate use, which we'll talk about in a minute. And essentially, the landscape is very complex and quite fragmented, as the US landscape is, but there are mechanisms that are in place in the US which allow accelerated access. So in the EU, not to be confused with accelerated assessment, but accelerated assessment is essentially granted by the EMA if the CHMP, so the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, review market authorization application, and it reduces the time for assessment of marketing authorization from around 210 days to 150 days is what it aims to do. And the PRIME scheme, which is kind of linked to the accelerated assessment scheme, which was launched in 2016, supports the developed medicines that target an unmet need by combining existing regulatory mechanisms, scientific advice, and accelerated access. So once you have accelerated access, you can be granted PRIME designation. And as most of these schemes are, they are based on an enhanced interaction and early dialogue between companies and the regulator to try and optimize development plans to prevent any delays at the regulatory point. And the 5-year review of the PRIME scheme was actually published very recently, and they found that the scheme does actually improve access in that it reduces the time on average for these drugs getting to patients, which is positive. So the next one we're talking about is ILAP, so the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway in the UK, and it was launched in 2021 with 41 approved products in year one, mainly in oncology, neurology, and respiratory indications. But the respiratory indications is potentially skewed a little bit by COVID in this particular time frame. But what you can see here is that we have a diagram which shows the drug development pipeline pathway, and you can see that the different points of ILAP are mapped on here. So the first point of the process is that a medicine is given an innovation passport following an application to the regulator, to MHRA, and a target development profile based on the TPP concept is drawn up in collaboration with the regulator and the company, and in theory also NICE and the SNC. So the criteria needed to be granted an innovation passport is in an indication that meets unmet need, some kind of general criteria of innovativeness, so ATMPs, so those genes and cell therapies that I spoke about before, rare diseases or special populations, or a new chemical or biological entity or a novel drug-device combination. So it's quite a broad definition of innovativeness. And then the third is the potential to benefit patients, so meeting and addressing an unmet need and actually being efficacious, presumed efficacious. So this comes before the EAMS scheme, which is the Early Access Medicine scheme that's run in the UK, which begins just before regulatory approval. And so the ILAP process aims to overcome some of the problems of the EAMS scheme, where actually companies were too far into the development process for their products in order to make any changes to the evidence that they were generating at the point of the EAMS scheme. And so the ILAP process brings all of those conversations much earlier, and in theory has a better match between the evidence needs of all parties. So here are the partners, and just to say that it is intended to be a collaboration between the regulator and the HTA bodies. So compassionate use is slightly different. It addresses an ethical need created by the regulatory pathway, whereby patients can suffer debilitating disease or die while they wait for a medicine that early evidence indicates is likely to be beneficial to them, although it might not, early evidence might not yet suggest whether it's beneficial to a wider patient population. So early access schemes tend to run in this kind of late clinical development regulatory approval phase, and there's three main types, so expanded access, compassionate use, and named patient access, and they are legal definitions that are used around the world that have slightly different aims and focus to them. But I'm just going to discuss quickly the French early access scheme because it's seen as one of the most innovative, and it's also undergone the most change recently. So it was formerly the ATU, which it was reformed in 2021 to simplify the scheme and to control costs, and also to bring in more control of the HTA body rather than it sitting entirely with the regulator. And there have also been further reforms this year to further expand the definition of innovativeness and allow the process to be a bit more responsive to population needs in light of COVID. So there's full reimbursement during the scheme with retrospective clawbacks of any difference based on price after value assessment, which is seen as a benefit of the scheme, but it's also a complicated thing to oversee as far as we can tell. And there's two arms. There's an early access arm and a compassionate use arm, and they can be granted before or after marketing authorization. So it really aims to bridge this gap between regulatory approval and HTA, which is seen to be a real need. As I said, it was formerly run entirely by the regulator and now is kind of sits mainly in HAS, which is the HTA agency. And there is a requirement for innovativeness, like the ILAP scheme, which focuses on unmet need, lack of appropriate alternatives. And the change that's come in this year has been a change in the definition of what appropriate alternatives means to allow more flexibility. I think, again, in light of COVID. So finally, in terms of our examples, we have adaptive pathways at the reimbursement level. So all the ones I just spoke about mainly concern the reimbursement level, although the French Early Access Scheme obviously combines the two. And adaptive pathways at the reimbursement level are really used to overcome uncertainty and cost effectiveness. And as you'll see in this diagram, there's kind of two main areas of these adaptive pathways. So there's performance-linked reimbursement, whereby a company is only paid for the products that meet a certain predefined clinical endpoint. And there's coverage with evidence development, where for a set period of time, the product is able to be used within the health system. Meanwhile, further real-world data studies are ongoing in the understanding of the effectiveness or the value of the medicine. Yeah, so as I said, they're the two to focus on, and I imagine will be covered later as well. So an example of this is the Innovative Medicines Fund, which is in the UK. So it's a £340 million fund, which was launched in 2022 by NHS England to support the rapid adoption of innovative medicines into the NHS, and is expanding on the concept of the Cancer Drugs Fund, and is a form of coverage with evidence development. And essentially you can see how it essentially works is that you have a novel medicine that goes through some form of, goes through a HTA by NICE, and it can either be directly approved for use within the NHS or directly rejected for reimbursement within the NHS, or it has this third option where it has a time-limited coverage with evidence development phase, after which there is a second HTA where the concerns about uncertainty have either been resolved or not, and then at that point it'd either be approved or rejected. So finally, coming to the end of my presentation, I'm just going to be talking through some of the challenges of adaptive pathways in practice from the different perspectives. So we have this quote that the introduction of adaptive pathways through the regulatory system will impact on other systems of the pharmaceutical framework, including the activities of payers. So essentially you generate this gap whereby adaptive pathways give companies the ability to generate enough evidence to get regulatory approval. Then at the time HTA happens, the HTA bodies don't have enough information to assess the value of the medicine, and so which potentially introduces delays, which is the main reason for the challenges. So payers' needs are not always covered through adaptive pathways, and this is why things like ILAP are being developed to try and bring those two together and try and overcome some of these historic barriers. There's for HTA, there's a lack of data to inform HTA collected through adaptive pathways. Earlier approval means that HTA just has more uncertainty, or the form of data that's generated in terms of real-world evidence is not current standards, like randomized controlled trials. It's based on smaller populations, potentially observational studies, which is difficult for HTA bodies. And finally, for manufacturers, there is a high data burden, and a disconnect between regulatory and HTA also adds some risk to them as well, and that there is an earlier start to the exclusivity window, which is a risk for them if that final HTA isn't expedited as much as the regulatory approval is. So my final slide, I have 4 key messages, which are that adaptive pathways are used to balance access and evidence development in health technology development. There are different mechanisms that support adaptive pathways in Europe, US and the UK. Compassionate use, as we spoke about with the French scheme, fulfills a different need to adaptive pathways, but for patients in exceptional need. and that there are these challenges to balancing the needs of payers and regulators through adaptive pathways. And I will hand back over to Martina.
Yep, thank you, Isabel. Thank you for providing an overview of the different types of adaptive pathways that have been implementing and highlighting the challenges related to that. So we're gonna, I just wanted to remind people who are listening to type your questions whenever some comes to mind, and I'll pick them up at the end during the panel discussion. But feel free to start asking questions in the Q&A box. Just to start getting a bit of engagement, I'm just going to ask the first poll questions, which is, to what extent have adaptive pathways you have experience with had a positive impact on patient access? And you need to choose between not at all, to some extent, and to a great extent. So please vote, and hopefully I'll be able to see the results. We'll wait just a few seconds. This is to understand if the adaptive pathways so far are filling one of the win that we talked about. And I can see a question about whether we're going to share the deck, and the answer is yes. And also you'll be able to access the recording of the webinar. So let's see the results, and the vast majority say to some extent. So there are some impact on providing treatments at an early stage, but is not to the full and the great extent. Good. Okay, so it's time to move on to Lottie's presentation, who is going to sort of deep dive onto the challenges between regulatory and HTA requirements, and discuss some solutions. Lottie, over to you. Thank you.
So thank you, Martina. So as the second speaker, I will talk a little bit about how can adaptive pathways bridge between regulatory and reimbursement. And I guess the answer to the previous poll that we just had is like, are they a solution? To some extent, I guess it quite resonates with the key messages of my talk today, but also thinking about how to sort of overcome some of those challenges that we're seeing. So the outline today is I will first talk about what gap is it actually that we're trying to bridge, what are the implications of uncertainty that may come with adaptive pathways, as Izzy already alluded to. What's the role of surrogate endpoints as part of the adaptive pathway? Are they part of the problem or part of the solution? And also what types of solutions would exist and how to use them. So first, if we want to find a solution to bridging the gap between regulatory and reimbursement in the context of adaptive pathways, and acknowledging there's a gap between regulatory and reimbursement in most countries, and it's really important to understand like what does that gap look like and what's causing it. Now, to more effectively sort of bridge between regulatory and reimbursement, this, I think, in my opinion at least, requires that we have to carefully look into this gap and what is it specifically that we're trying to solve for. So if we think about adaptive pathways, then we see that the regulatory assessment really focuses mostly on efficacy and safety. And we see the bridge or the gap with reimbursement is really about like longer term data, for example, around effectiveness in the real world, cost effectiveness, affordability, but also data on other patient-centric outcomes such as health-related quality of life and well-being. And when there's uncertainty around one of those, there's always a risk that there will be some delay at some point, which is contrary to the idea of adaptive pathways that are basically invented to accelerate patient access, at least for specific populations. So how to sort of think about that and what to do about that. So if we're thinking about it, then what are the implications of this uncertainty in the context of adaptive pathways? Now, before we sort of talk about that in the actual sort of specific context of like how to overcome them, I think it's really critically important to grasp that not all uncertainty that regulatory or reimbursement agencies, HTA agencies, are facing is decision uncertainty. And if you indulge me to become a little bit more technical for a minute, so if you look at this sort of typical cost effectiveness isoplane, then you see two clouds of data points. One is a small purple one on top called B, and the bigger one, a blue one, below that. Now, if you consider both of these, then we see that there's more uncertainty in this blue cloud, which is called A, and there's relatively little uncertainty around the actual ICER in the smaller purple cloud B. However, the purple cloud is located exactly on top of the willingness to pay threshold. And essentially, the uncertainty you have there is really, really large. It couldn't be any bigger. It can be about 50%. So if you consider that and compare that to blue cloud A, then there is more uncertainty about what the actual ICER would be, but there's no decision uncertainty because all the simulated results are below the willingness to pay threshold. So decision uncertainty is not the same as uncertainty in general, and this is really critical to keep in mind when we're thinking about the rest of this talk. So when we talk about decision uncertainty, it is also quite relevant to think about how to deal with that and what it means for decision makers. So based on value of information theory, and a couple of papers on this have been shown on this slide, is that decision uncertainty does matter to a risk-neutral decision maker because it means there's a risk of making the wrong decision. For example, adopting a new treatment that is not cost-effective, or vice versa, not adopting a treatment when it actually, in reality, would be cost-effective. But it's also important to understand that this is actually irrelevant to decision-making unless there is a way to sort of reduce that uncertainty by additional research. So if it can be solved by further data collection, then it's important to consider. But if that's not an option at all, at that point, decision makers would just have to make the decision. Now, logically from this, it also follows that evidence collection should be cost-effective in itself. So the expected value of reducing that uncertainty, that is, reducing the risk of making the wrong decision, making an error, should be greater than the cost of doing the further research. And also further research may delay access to patients, so there could also be any impact on patient access that has a cost to it, one way or the other, and that should be taken into account. So moving on to the next slide, summarizing this in a much more simpler way, is that in essence, when there's decision uncertainty, decision makers have to balance the consequences of making that wrong decision and with the cost of further research. And only when the cost of further research outbalances sort of the consequences of the wrong decision, you should basically make that decision. So how can payers essentially deal with decision uncertainty? Well, at its simplest, you can think about it as having four options. And I'm going to start at the extremes of this continuum. So decision makers can accept a new technology when, for example, there is good evidence that it would be cost effective. That also means there will not likely be further research, so this would disincentivize further research. But also, if still the decision would be wrong, there will be irrecoverable cost of making that decision. On the other hand, decision makers could reject a new therapy if it's not considered to be cost effective. And that would have irrecoverable health losses if wrong, but also disincentivize further research. Now, typically in cases where there is more decision uncertainty, there's now more flexibility, there's more options. And one of those would be to accept the technology with further research. So that facilitates the collection of further data. It would facilitate earlier patient access, but it may also need delisting or price adaptation later on, depending on what the further research would tell the decision maker about the value or the cost effectiveness of that therapy. And then the other slightly more restricted option is only in research. That again would also facilitate further research, but would only provide access to patients that are participating in that research and not to the wider population. And also there would be no guaranteed reimbursement because that would depend on the results of that further research. So these are essentially like the four buckets of options that payers or decision HTA bodies have at their disposal. And that's interesting to sort of consider like what that would mean for industry as well. So to summarize this bit is that the implications for accelerated approval for The decision uncertainty is that innovators may pursue accelerated pathways for licensing to get earlier revenue and provide products to the patients. But this also often means that there's considerable uncertainty about the expected outcomes from treatment and likely cost effectiveness at the point at which payers and HTA bodies start to consider their reimbursement decisions. So the question that remains is that should payers either approve, reject, ask for more evidence, or approve conditionally, subject to more evidence being collected, and should industry pursue these accelerated approval pathways at the trade-off of facing this increased decision uncertainty later on? Now, before I'm going to sort of answer those questions, let's first take a deeper dive into the role of surrogates and whether they are part of the problem or can they also be part of the solution. So the problems of surrogates have been well described in the literature, and people talk about them quite often. And they include, for example, the need to extrapolate to a primary endpoint. They may carry a greater risk of suggesting treatment does or does not work, where in fact the opposite may be true. And false positives are often, sometimes more often observed, though there might also be some element of publication bias to that. But they can also be a solution for many reasons. They're usually continuous, often repeatedly measured, and therefore they can provide more statistical power than some of the end outcomes of patients. Surrogates are also preferred when you're looking into small sample sizes or when crossover of patients among trial arms is likely to generate bias on the endpoints, such as overall survival. And there may also be other circumstantial or ethical reasons why surrogates are preferred over other outcomes. So this study that sort of looked into this concludes by saying that although the use of surrogates can be problematic, they can also, when you select them and validate them carefully, offer very important opportunities for more efficient clinical trials and faster access to new health technologies that really benefit patients as well as healthcare systems more broadly. So if we think about this a little bit further, then, and I'm not going to sort of talk about all the elements on this slide. So what would it mean to sort of look at surrogate endpoints in more detail? This is basically a fairly straightforward three-step approach. First of all, when thinking about surrogate endpoints, it would be very relevant to first of all establish the level of evidence. So what is the hierarchy of available evidence about the link between the surrogate and the endpoint? And then the next step would be, has this been validated? So what is the strength of the association? Is the surrogate associated with or even predictive of the final outcome? And is it possible with the data that exists on the relationship between the surrogate and the final outcome to really sort of predict the observed effect on the final outcomes? So if you think about a fairly straightforward three-step approach, there's likely much more people can do with surrogate endpoints than they are currently doing. Now, as any presentation is only as good as its most confusing slide. This is mine. And this is an adaptive figure from a study published by Siadi et al. In 2017. And basically, this shows the results of their work. They sifted through 124 HTA reports from 8 HTA agencies. And they looked at how these agencies dealt with or did not deal with surrogates. And for every agency, they analyzed really 4 critical aspects, including whether the surrogate was accepted, and also the 3 steps of the surrogate evaluation framework I just mentioned. So looking at the validation, for example, and the potential predictive value of a surrogate. So the vertical axis here shows what percentage of surrogates was accepted and for what proportion the level of evidence was assessed. And acceptance or assessment done is shown by the dark gray bar on top of the chart. If it's not done, it's black, and if it's unclear, it's shown in the light gray bar. Now, NICE, which is shown in the teal rectangle, for example, has accepted most of the surrogates as part of the evidence package in the reports that were included in the study, and also considered the level of evidence for most of them as well as the quantification of effect. And a similar pattern can be seen, for example, for Canada, the Netherlands, and some other countries. Now, by contrast, the German HTA agency, shown in orange, has not accepted the majority of surrogates, but also in most cases did not even assess the level of evidence, the strength or the association, or the quantification of effect. So the key takeaway from this is that how would surrogates affect decision making? Well, the first point is starting to look at them more carefully. So overall, this research suggested the surrogate endpoint was deemed acceptable in 40% of reports, and that increased when the level of evidence was considered and was associated with accepting the surrogate endpoint as valid. However, the study did not find a strong evidence of the association between accepting the surrogate as part of the evidence and the final outcome, the final reimbursement that the agency did, because more factors are at play than whether or not the surrogate is accepted. So then, how is decision uncertainty as the result of surrogate endpoints handled? Sometimes conditional approval issues, for example, based on price discount agreements, patient access, risk-sharing agreements with evidence development, for example, the UK Cancer Drugs Fund, and sometimes by restricting the indication to a smaller part of the patient population, and also conversely, sometimes by applying a more permissive evaluation framework that is more flexible, or using elements such as orphan designation and applied, etc. We have to note that not all of these really actually resolve uncertainty, but it is a more flexible way of dealing with things. So now moving on to a key part of this presentation. So risk sharing as a possible solution to address decision uncertainty, and can it keep up the acceleration? So risk sharing would potentially enable temporary confidential price agreements that provide patient access while additional evidence is collected to reduce the uncertainty. It can enable price and use adjustments when the new evidence is accessed. It can address the irreversibility and exit issues, and it enables payers to move from reject of only in research to only with research plus risk sharing. But it's also very important to consider the view of the innovator on the underlying cost effectiveness to figure out whether this will work in practice. So a paper written by Adrian Daus and Fennick, published on the OHC website, looks really into the importance of differences in payer and innovator perceptions. And it's important to note that the existing literature really takes typically a payer view, which essentially ignores some of the market dynamics. And there may actually be genuine differences about the incremental net benefit and the value of further research, here written as ENBS, the expected net benefit of further sampling, that will impact the outcome. And this is completely separate from the bargaining process. Now, if there's basically 4 ways to sort of deal with uncertainty, which was accept, reject, only with research or only in research, then we can see there can be 16 options in total for each participant. So the payer can have one view on the existing evidence base, and the innovator can have another view. Now, what does that mean? And how can risk-sharing arrangements play a role in this? So here's just one example based on like one potential way of things, which things could play out in practice. So for example, the payer would recognize there is uncertainty around the cost effectiveness of a new treatment, and it figures that further research is worthwhile. So the data suggests to them that the technology could be cost effective at the price offered, so there's some uncertainty there, but their best estimate suggests it doesn't. At that point, the payer would recommend an only in research, so there's uncertainty. We will do further research in a limited population, and only they will have access to the treatment, and based on that, we can revise the decision. However, payers may have a different view, and they would consider that this new treatment is cost effective with the current evidence, and then for them, the risk-sharing approach could help to move from this only in research to only with research, including a risk-sharing. So considering again that there can be 16 options in total, the research that was done and published in this paper shows that in 9 out of the 16 cases, risk-sharing can actually be a solution to move forward from either accept or from a reject, for example, to a risk share with some option for further research and earlier patient access. So outcome-based payments have been around for a long time, so I'm not going to dwell on this also for the sake of time. And there's different forms that we can identify here. So this is the same slide as Izzy showed. There's essentially a couple of options, and the question really is which one of those risk-sharing arrangements would make sense to sort of pursue in the case of adaptive pathways. And the answer to that really is, it depends. If the uncertainty that is being considered is mostly about budget, finances, then financial-based agreements would make the most sense. So, for example, price-volume agreements, budget caps, or discounts. But if the uncertainty is mostly around the value or the effectiveness of the new treatment, then you would be looking at outcomes-based agreements such as performance-linked agreements, conditional reimbursement, etc. However, what we see in practice is that risk-sharing agreements that have been implemented typically take the form of refunds based on volumes, no ties to the actual outcomes, patient outcomes, even when the aims of those schemes was to address the uncertainty around the clinical effectiveness. So there seems to be a mismatch between what the schemes are designed for and what they're trying to solve. And the main driver of the implemented scheme seems to be affordability rather than managing uncertainty. And therefore, it's basically cost sharing rather than risk sharing that we have implemented. And that is a problem because that won't help. So OHE has led a large program of research, which was funded by Cancer Research UK, to really look into this in more detail, like how can we design real outcome-based payment schemes and make those a reality in the NHS to help bridge the gap, because it's not a simple thing to do, as we've seen from the literature and from real-life examples. And the results of those studies have been published on the website, including some practical implications of how to do this. So my final slides are really what is the way forward. First of all, we have to mind the gap. We see a very rapidly changing landscape and increasing uncertainty, and also an increasing use of surrogate endpoints. Now, risk-sharing agreements are quite well placed to help bridge the gap, but we really need to be clear on how we use those and also how we implement those. And finally, a bridge is built from two sides. So while there's various examples of risk-sharing agreements, few have been thought through quite well enough to guarantee that we actually work as intended. And further work has to be done in this space. And with that, I will hand over back to Martina.
Great, thank you, Lotte. So we're going to answer your question. I can see there is one, and then just before getting into the panel, I just wanted to get some sort of more views from you on the challenges related to adaptive pathways. And so with this poll, we'd like to know what is the most urgent challenge to fulfill the promises of adaptive pathways. So one option is collect real-world evidence post-license. Another option is establish an HTA process supporting multiple review stages as more evidence becomes available. Accept those surrogate endpoints by HTA, and agree and implement the appropriate risk-sharing agreements or anything else. So please vote before we move on into sort of answering your questions. So we moved too quickly. And I probably just showed the wrong slide. So that's the slide for voting. So you can click on the option. And we're going to discuss those options in the panel. So now you can vote. Hopefully we can see some results. I'm not sure we are ready. Okay, I think it's probably better if we move on. Anyway, to allow to answer your questions. And so in general, we would like to sort of explore what are the prospects for adaptive pathways and its key challenges and opportunities. But before getting into that, I wanted to answer one of the questions that Kaila's put into the Q&A box, which is around, if I interpret it correctly, is around the sort of the governance and data handling related to real-world evidence. So particularly in terms of the patient data, where the health systems have some tools for RCT, but those cannot be used for commercial agreements or pathways. And so what are the tools required to bridge this gap, and how quickly health systems can implement new pathways? So I'm just wondering, so I'm going to call the panelists, and probably Adrian would be good to to hear your view on this, and so it'd be great if everyone is joining the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Martina. Well, first of all, before I get to the observational data, I mean, you can conduct RCTs as part of a commercial agreement. So, an obvious example in oncology being where you may have progression-free survival, which has been the basis of the registration dossier and indeed the original HTA dossier. But the trials continue to run on and will collect overall survival data. So it's possible to have the commercial agreement linked to the eventual outcome of those trials. So I think if we think about real-world evidence, if we take the FDA definition, then it includes pragmatic trials, but obviously the main element is observational data. And here the rules, as it were, vary from country to country, but by and large, if you're using observational data, then providing you're able to, it's pseudo-anonymized and it's not possible in the analysis to identify individual patients, then they're not covered by the same sorts of rules as would apply to getting patient consent for involvement in an RCT. So I think as I understand the question, I think the barriers to using observational data in a commercial agreement are relatively low.
Okay, thank you. So we got another question, this time for Lotte, around the feasibility of implementing different risk-sharing agreements. She provided quite a lot of sort of details and options on how the types, and so the question is around how different risk-sharing agreements can be implemented across different countries, and what are the main challenges you currently see?
Very good question. Thank you for that. I guess there's a couple of challenges, and I sort of like to sort of summarize those with DDT is data, design, and trust. So data is a challenge. You will need to have access to sometimes real-world data or other data sources, and as Adrian just discussed, that can be more or less easy to do in different countries, depending on the rules around that for commercial agreements, but that's typically feasible, considering that you're looking at fairly straightforward to measure risk-sharing agreements. So as long as you look at things like overall survival, even progression-free survival in oncology, for example, that is fairly well doable. As soon as you move into patient-reported outcomes, it gets more tricky to sort of get those data. Then the other one is sort of designing them. So these schemes should be as simple as possible to really, work, but also complex enough to sort of make sure you capture the right outcomes. And I think it's really critical to discuss in an early stage with the relevant stakeholders involved in this, and that's where the trust comes in. Like, what are we, collectively trying to achieve here? Like, what is it really that we need to measure, and how can we sort of then link what we are measuring to the actual decisions to be made, and at what point in time? So these schemes would typically be in place, in my opinion, for for a limited amount of time, where you measure important outcomes that you can measure as reliably as possible. But also think about what would then be the sort of the decision rule based on which you will make your final decision about how to pay for that new treatment. So I think simplicity is key. Trust between the stakeholders to sort of sit together around the table and discuss, what is a win-win here, a triple win as part that should be the end outcome of this pathway.
Great, thank you. And then I can see another question around more about the infrastructure, so saying that we also need adaptive infrastructure, electronic health record system and care management are not flexible. So I was wondering if, Adrian, what you want to pick this up? Is this another key barrier for real-world evidence coverage with evidence development?
Well, I think it's the fundamental challenge. So, as Lottie showed, the logic is in most situations where you have a disagreement between the payer and the HTA body and the innovator about the uncertainty around the evidence, such that the payer's instinct is not to approve the drug at the price that is being requested. Then, in most of those situations, some sort of risk-sharing agreement is optimal in terms of giving patients access while that uncertainty is addressed. But of course, we don't get very many agreements in practice, and that's because of the issues that are in the questions here. As in, we typically require setting up some sort of bespoke data collection system, which is very clunky and can be very expensive, and can take time. So I think a lot of it is really around the extent to which we can streamline those, and I think there are two different ways. So the first, which I think the one of the questioner is hinting at, is if you're collecting, if you're going in a health system A for reimbursement of a drug, you don't have to collect data in that health system, even real world evidence. It should be possible to collect it in health system B or C. And make the case that it's relevant to a decision. The patients and the health system has sufficient commonality that it's relevant to patients in health system A. We do that routinely in regulatory settings. We need to be able to do that with observational data as well. But the second is, if we really want to do things in a particular health system, then we have to, as Lottie was saying, be incredibly pragmatic and be willing to accept surrogate data points, as in, well, let's take a simple example that's been used in the US. So the receptiveness of the patient to an oncology treatment might be how long they stay on the treatment. So if they stay on for one cycle and then stop, the assumption is if they haven't sadly died, then actually they're not a responder to that treatment. So there are innovative ways in which you can look at what data you have got if you really, really want to have information about what's happening in that particular health system.
Great. Yeah, thank you for your answer on this. And I mean, picking up on the you mentioned that, you know, with real world evidence, it doesn't have to be collected in every single country you go for access for, but we do see quite a lot of fragmented approaches around, and what Lottie showed about, for example, surrogate endpoints, so different ways to consider the evidence, different evidence standards accepted. So how do we go for this? And so I'm asking Lottie about this, and in particular on the surrogate endpoints. Has it had any impact on timelines? Even if they're accepted, does it mean that it takes longer to go through the assessment?
If you're working with a surrogate endpoint that has been accepted previously, it will presumably speed up what you're doing compared to the counterfactual of not using that surrogate endpoint and having to collect the overall survival data, for example, if we're speaking about oncology. If you're working with a surrogate endpoint that has not been used that much, maybe it's not as well established, I think then it's more tricky to say what will be quicker for that particular assessment, for that particular dossier. Nevertheless, I think there's lots of research done in this space, like how to better use surrogate endpoints. And we also see from the research that as soon as HTA bodies start to engage more with surrogate endpoints and try to understand them better, even if they're new, and that already has an impact on them sort of accepting those surrogate endpoints and sort of taking some learnings on what are good ones and what are maybe less good ones, and basically sort of moving the field forward that way.
Great, thank you. I think we have run out of time now. Unfortunately, it would be good to keep discussing this very interesting topic, and I think we've answered your questions. Please, remember that you can listen to this, and if you want, you can engage with us offline. And so I think what we sort of briefly, just to wrap up, I think what we saw different forms of adaptive pathways, from regulatory tools to HTA methods and pricing schemes. And we also see that when used appropriately, they can lead to accelerated access to promising therapies in targeting unmet needs. But I mean, in a way, we also saw that they can complicate the analysis and the assessment at the HTA level. So there is a need to identify the appropriate scheme, including risk-sharing schemes that can bridge the gap between regulatory and HTA. And key on all of this is early engagement and early considerations of the options and the trade-off from all parties included, such as the manufacturers and the payers. So I'm going to close it now, thanking you all the speakers and evidence base, and I'm going to pass it back to Olivia.
Great. Thank you so much, Martina, and thank you all for that really interesting discussion. So yeah, as we just round off today's webinar, I'd just like to remind you all that if you would like to give us your feedback about today's webinar, then please feel free to do so by completing our feedback survey in the resources widget, or you can just tweet us at the Evibase. Don't forget, you can also download your certificate of attendance for today's event. You'll also be emailed a link to access that after the event has finished. If you'd like to learn more about adaptive pathways, then you can find out more at theevidencebase.com. And apart from that, thank you all again so much for attending, and goodbye.